All right. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to peers on the East Coast. I hope all of you are celebrating the power of information and technology in healthcare this week and attending a variety of events supporting the National Health IT Week. I don't know how many of you have read through the HIMSS website, but they've created a Twitter handle called iHeartHIT that is actually sharing authentic and personal stories from patients, family members, and healthcare professionals to describe how information and technology in healthcare has helped them. At American College of Clinical Engineering, ACC, we wanted to share a webinar around how health systems can select an effective risk management solution for connected devices. This is very much in scope for healthcare technology management industry and more so to everyone in health IT. So thanks to ACC and our co-presenters from Asimily and Synergistek for sharing their expertise on this topic. Today's webinar will provide health systems the guidance on how they can assess their medical device security program gaps, use those program gaps to formulate a set of use cases, select risk management solutions that provide meaningful information, not only to bridge the program gaps, but also to take action on remediating and managing the risks from these connected devices. Our speakers will review how they have worked with health systems to evaluate programs to maintain compliance with HIPAA and NIST CSF elements as it's applicable for connected devices. They will then discuss feature sets of a risk management platform that will help health systems improve the overall risk management process of these devices in various ways. Let me start with a short overview of the American College of Clinical Engineering, which was formed in 1990 to establish a standard of competence and promote excellence in clinical engineering practice. ACC members are all voluntary and they participate in patient safety initiatives. Many hold representation in HIMSS, AMI, ASHE, ACHE, and HISAC and are experts in very many healthcare technology principles and most specifically CEIT or health IT topics. Skankar will provide an overview of Asimily now.
Yeah, so thanks, Priya. So Asimily is a venture-backed company. We are focused only on connected devices in healthcare. And we have a number of leading venture capitalists in the California area who are backed us where we are. And our members are coming with expertise in different areas, predominantly in healthcare, because that's our core focus, cybersecurity, networking, and broadly analytics as well, worked in a number of companies. And we have been backed and currently are being backed by a variety of people from the healthcare industry, like Steve, Axel, and others. And today we solve for a number of use cases around inventory, cybersecurity, and operational, and we are actually expanding on that. And we integrate with a number of systems, whether it's a CMMS or a SIM or a NAC or a scanner or anything else. So I'll let Cory introduce Synergistek now.
Thank you, Skankar. So as a healthcare-focused consulting firm, Synergistek has been considered best in class for various cybersecurity services with over 1,000 hospitals in our client base. However, we've spent, in just the past few years, we've really dug into the medical device security services space. So as a trusted advisor in this healthcare area, our clients have been coming to us requesting for our assistance with this major gap in medical device security. So Synergistek has built a team of individuals experienced in both clinical engineering and information security processes, myself being one of those lucky individuals. And we've really just been adapting Synergistek's tried and true process for enterprise risk assessments and remediation to better suit the needs of our clients for their medical device security program. We've aligned our processes with industry best practices and standards, including the NIST CSF, MITRE, FDA guidance, as well as AMI's risk management strategy for medical device security. I'm a member of AMI's Healthcare Technology Leadership Council, and we have various other subject matter experts on our team that sit on boards for organizations in this space as well. And in some cases, while we do have the background knowledge and expertise, we've still been learning with our clients as we go with some of the more recent industry trends around the medical Internet of Things. And unfortunately, recent medical device security incidents. but we have learned quite a bit as we've been going, including the best way for going about selecting a risk management solution for connected medical devices. So with that being said, we'll talk about some of the challenges impacting health systems, specifically when it comes to medical device security and what we're trying to solve for with a risk management solution. First, asset management procedures are fairly inconsistent at the health system level for creating and maintaining an up-to-date inventory database, and also a database that includes those attributes for network connected medical devices, and in some cases, even typical IoT devices. This issue has led to a decreased level of probability for detection when these types of assets go missing, or really even for being able to quickly identify those assets in the case of an incident. And also something really just as inconsistent as asset management in this space has really been the governance, risk, and compliance frameworks for network connected medical devices versus those for your typical IT systems. Medical devices are just traditionally supported more when it comes to oversight for those Joint Commission and environment of care type of regulations, but really much less so for any kind of security risk or compliance type of framework. So this issue has really includes a lack of, documenting risks associated with the devices, as well as any exceptions to the organization's basic security requirements when it comes to those medical devices. There's also a lack of any type of baseline configuration standard for deploying new medical devices into the health system environment. So a lot of times, the way that these devices are deployed into the clinical environment after they've been purchased is not done according to any kind of standard format in order to ensure that they've been hardened or secured on the network and following this organization's security requirements. And again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of times, if not the majority of the time, medical devices can't be totally compliant with IT security policies in the first place, but actually documenting this non-compliance and managing or monitoring the exceptions is an extremely resource-intensive process, and we've really seen it, has been difficult to keep up with. And last, but certainly not least on this slide, one thing we definitely see very consistently across healthcare organizations that we work with is a serious lack of any kind of centralized account management for medical devices, which leads to either zero account management processes for the devices at all, or at the very least, a mismanaged provisioning for vendor access and inbound and outbound communications from those devices. Okay, so I mentioned earlier when I was introducing myself and Synergistek that in kind of developing our medical device security services, we really started with this baseline framework from our enterprise risk assessment process, which was developed specifically using the NIST CSF as well as HIPAA framework. But we really wanted to evolve our medical device security program piece to be more medical device or clinical engineering friendly. And we really wanted to ensure that the reports we were providing for our clients were truly usable and presented in a format that would be translatable, not only for the IT and security departments, but also for clinical engineering or biomed. So that remains true here with this risk management solution, because we know that more than likely the clinical engineering teams are going to be the ones responsible for remediating most of the gaps that have been identified. We broke down the NIST and HIPAA frameworks and mapped them to other risk management strategies specifically for medical device security, which includes, industry best practice guidance, like I mentioned again, from organizations like MITRE and AMI. And in this slide, you can see how we were able to do this and map it to some of our reports and our findings. Basically, this just shows how on the far left, we started with the individual NIST sections and components and continued to dive deeper into a more granular level of detail when evaluating the program for maturity and providing recommendations for improving the program. Many of those recommendations centered around using a specific technology or risk management solution to manage the standard processes such as you can see, inventory, vulnerability management, micro-segmentation for the devices or secure network controls, and forensic analysis in the event of a security incident involving a medical device. And I think that Shankar is now going to discuss how Asimily features actually align with what's needed to meet these requirements.
Thank you, Cory. And just a quick update for our attendees. If anyone has any questions, there is a chat box that you can type your questions in. And during the last 15 minutes of this webinar, we'll actually get our experts to answer those questions. Shankar?
Yeah, thank you, Priya. So like Cory mentioned, there is the framework. We started with the NIST framework here. But what Asimily did is, since we are focused on healthcare, we said, how do we build a solution bottoms up that can help the health system with their entire medical device security program on the security side, while making sure we hit all the elements of the framework, whether it's NIST or whether it's MITRE or whether it's AME TI 57. So here we are comparing with the NIST framework. And so we have broken down, as Cory mentioned, into the different elements. So I'm going to go over the different solution components that map to these elements. So the first one is inventory. So this is the baseline where you're identifying all the devices and all the parameters about the devices and everything about the device, so you can take further action and understand more about what's in your environment. And I'm going to go into more detail into each of these building blocks in the next few slides. The next one is around vulnerability management, scoring, and assessment. Now, this is an important module because unlike IT devices, with medical devices, you cannot just patch them whenever you want. You need the manufacturer patch. It's not always available. You cannot just segment and quarantine every device in your network. So, but at the same time, all your medical devices are generally vulnerable. They're running old operating systems. So what do you do? So here there's a 4-step process Asimily does, which is what we mapped to the NIST framework. The first step is identification of vulnerabilities. But that's not the end all be all like IT. That's just the first step. The second step is to figure out whether the vulnerability even poses a threat. So you might have a Windows XP, which honestly might not be at risk in your environment for that device because of the way the XP machine is configured. So you have to figure out whether it poses a threat. For that, you not only need to know how the device is configured, but the security capabilities of the device and the exploit vectors. And then you need to know the vulnerabilities from a medical device context, the priority. Does it have an impact on patient? Does it have an impact on data? Does it have an impact on business? How is it connected? All of that. And then finally, you need to provide, Asimily provides very granular recommendations which go beyond segmentation or blocking or quarantining or patching, very granular recommendations that can be enforced, that can mitigate the risk of a vulnerability without necessarily having to do a patch or a segment or a quarantine. And then as part of detect, you have the intrusion detection, which is about baselining the device, figuring out the anomaly, figuring out when there's a problem, when it's behaving outside of norms. Then you come to the protection piece, which is around containment and microsegmentation, where you're blocking or quarantining a device if you need to. That's generally most health systems don't do that. We have been working with a number of health systems across the country. This is the last resort, so you only block and quarantine as required. And then other option is segmenting or microsegmenting the services or device. And Asimily, through the Asimily portal, you can do all of that. But the idea here is you might have, let's say, a category of devices that you put in a given segment, or you might have a subset of medical devices you put in a segment that make sure there's some level of protection in your environment. And finally, you always need some level of forensic analysis because you always want to be able to look back. Security is an ever-evolving landscape. So this is an area we have been doing a lot of work on. And some of the points we have looked at is, you have to go back and look, how was the device communicating? Where was the device communicating? When was the device communicating? What service was it communicating? And you got to identify the root cause of the problem. Knowing there's an anomaly is not enough. Knowing where the anomaly is originating, knowing where the scan is originating, knowing where the issue is originating from is equally important. And like I mentioned at the end, with vulnerability management, the key here is you have to be able to mitigate risk without necessarily always having to patch, segment, or block. And that's one of the key value adds here. Thank you. Next slide, Priya. So now I'll go through each of these components. And some of this I already mentioned, so I can go over some of this quickly. So the inventory management is the first piece where you effectively extract everything about the device. It includes the IT parameters like IP, MAC, port protocol, host name, operating system, all of that. The medical device parameters like manufacturer, make, model, serial number, firmware version, all of that, and many others. The cybersecurity properties, like does it use anti-malware? Does it have certificates? Does it allow you to install anti-malware? Does it have encryption? Does it do logging? All of that stuff and many more that you can extract from the network But one of the things Asimily does is it very deeply integrates with MDS2. So we are able to pull all those capabilities from MDS2, which feeds both into the inventory analysis and the risk analysis. And then there's also the cyber bill of materials we started to pull information from, which has just been provided this year by some of the manufacturers. And then the final piece is the topology. How is the device connected? Where is the data flowing? Because you need to understand whether your device is configured correctly in your network. So all of this together forms the inventory management piece. Next slide. And so from an inventory perspective, I think it's fairly obvious to many health systems that this is a very critical element because it bridges the gap between what's there in your HTM or your HTM system, maybe a CMMS system, and what your IT thinks. Plus, you need to know because sometimes some of this hardware appears as commodity hardware, like a Dell on the network, but in reality, it's a medical device. So this kind of accurate inventory bridges that gap, and you also understand better how to manage your risk profile. And the other important thing, something that Asimily goes very deeply on, is you can track missing or lost connected devices, and within that, you can actually see which of those devices have PHI. So if you know that a device is no longer being seen on the network, it was seen on the network, let's say 10 days ago, and it suddenly went off the network, and it's no longer there, it's not coming back, and it has PHI, you probably want to go and check where it is. And this has operational benefits as well, because remember, your infusion pumps sit in a closet, and we have seen a lot of health systems saying, Shankar, the infusion pump's in the closet, we lost track of it. Or it's sitting in some maintenance line, we lost track. And so this kind of ability to track the devices, figure out whether it has PHI helps a great deal, both from an operational perspective and cyber risk perspective, and developing a risk management strategy along with the other parameters. And then all of this information we feed into different CMMS systems and correlate this information. And in this case, like, with Banner, for example, we had a 99.5% accuracy in terms of what we were able to find on the network and what's in the CMMS. And this is an example of analysis of a health system. I mean, the data, this is just a few columns. And in the Asimily portal, there's just a snapshot of the Asimily portal. You can search on this data in many different ways. There's just a sample list of searches. There's a lot more ways to search. And these are just sample list of columns. There are a lot more columns you can see, and you can export what you want. Next slide. And these are again a sample list. So here you can see the manufacturer, the device type, the model. We discover the operating system, the host name, the risk score, the utilization anomaly, all of that. And again, these are a subset of the columns. The Asimily portal allows you to pick which columns you want to see. And here in this case, these were the columns that were picked. And there is a lot of information here that can be used. And it goes pages, and you can extract this, get summary charts out of it. So it really helps with the inventory piece. Next one. The next piece is the vulnerability management and intrusion detection. And this is something I already touched upon in terms of concept. So like I mentioned, discovering the vulnerabilities is just the first step. But knowing the vulnerabilities is not enough. The other half of the vulnerability is the exploit vector, because you have to figure out whether the vulnerability is something that poses a threat to your network. And this is a research that Asimily does on every vulnerability that has ever come out since 1995, and we do it on a monthly. And so that is combined with the vulnerability and the device configuration to figure out whether it's a threat. But then you also need to look at the impact in terms of patient care, in terms of data, in terms of business or operations. You need to look at the capabilities, many of which I mentioned, like anti-malware certificates, all of which have an impact. Some of it comes from the network, like I mentioned. Some of it comes from the MDS2. You need to see how the device is connected, because something buried deep in your network might have lesser risk than something that's more exposed. All of that allows you to do the vulnerability management, and then you provide recommendations. And then on the intrusion detection, you need to baseline the device, profile the device, and then compare the device with other devices in the network, which can be also used to discover anomalies or any other misbehavior, and then recommendations for all of them. Next slide. So from a health system perspective, as you can imagine, one thing I have to mention here is this is important. As you imagine, risk management is the fundamental basis of healthcare. That's your effectively medical device security is a risk management problem. But you cannot actively scan many of these devices. There have been a number of reports, number of presentations, number of research done that shows active scanning medical devices has adverse effects. So Asimily has its own passive discovery. We do integrate with active scanners to get that, but passive discovery is what we recommend for many of these medical and IoT devices. And then we do this at the health system, this kind of exploit analysis where we look at both the vulnerability, the exploit vector, really reduces the extent to which you need to focus on. Because if you have 1,000 vulnerabilities and only 100 of them are really exploitable, then that really allows you to focus on the critical few. And then within that, if you look at the impacts, if you look at the relationships, if you look at the device-specific security capabilities, it really gives you a small set of devices to prioritize on. Those are your high-impact devices, and those are the ones that you really need to go after. And because these devices cannot be patched, Asimily provides a number of other controls that you can use to implement in your environment. And these are, like I said, these are not just segmentation and blocking. These are other kind of recommendations that can be enforced on the network that will mitigate the risk without necessarily doing a patch or a segment. Next slide. So this is an example of just one vulnerability. It was on one of the devices. And this is a kernel level vulnerability. You can see the description. It's a kernel level vulnerability. And the vulnerability exploit vectors here are exploit vectors that Asimily does research on this particular vulnerability. And like this, there is research on hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities in our database. So this is one example. And while we couldn't patch this device, what we found was periodically someone was using that particular device to do some form of email. Maybe they just quickly logged in, checked it. That happens sometimes. That was the exploit vector for this vulnerability. So even though you couldn't patch this vulnerability by just blocking that particular action, which really is not needed for that particular medical device, and you could mitigate the risk posed by that vulnerability without having to go take an action. And this is a slightly high level. Then you have a lot more granular, which tell you to take action on a given service, on a given port, and mitigates the risk. And 99.99% of the cases, it's never really required for the device operation. And so it's something that can be done. And we actually show all the ways we calculate the vulnerability. So if your IT team wants, you can take these parameters and apply it on their side and get the score as well. And this is an example on the anomaly side. So anomaly, there are tons of different anomalies that we detect. One of the different kinds of anomalies, and so it's hard to show all of them here, so we just took one example. One of the different kinds of anomalies is what kind of services, what kind of countries is the device dialing up to, or are the devices dialing up to. So in this country, like we map it to a world map to show where it's going. And then on top of it, we don't have the chart here. We show what kind of services is the device using it to dial out. Is it using an RDP? Is it using an FTP? Is it using an SMB? So this will help you understand, one, what are the manufacturers doing with your devices? One, because some of those are sanctioned by the manufacturer. And you might look at it and say, hey, this is sanctioned by the manufacturer, but I really don't want the manufacturer to be doing this. Whereas some others might be completely undesirable. You might have an app on that medical device you might not know about. You might have someone doing things that is probably not should be done. And all of those are causing anomalies. And sometimes we have seen a device also might be misconfigured and is reaching out to IPs in countries which it should never even attempt to reach out to. So all of that can be mapped as one kind of anomaly. And this is just one subset of anomalies. And then you use the combination of world map, the services, all of that to figure out whether it's allowed or not allowed. Next piece. So the next piece is segmentation, quarantine, and blocking. And so here I also see a question, so I can help address that. So there's a question on how well we integrate with the NAC and the rules for the communication. How specific is it for creation and compliance? So here, let me address that as part of this. So protection through segmentation content blocking is the third step of the puzzle, something that Asimily has done a lot of work on. And here, there are 4 components to it broadly, before I mention what we do. One of it is, the first one is blocking the device on the network itself. So you want to make sure if you absolutely are in a bad position, you want to block it. Or instead of blocking an entire device, a more favorable option is to quarantine a specific device or port so that, you make sure that a given service or port is not allowed. And you can go even more granular in terms of quarantining a device or a port to a particular destination. And then you have the third and fourth option, which is to segment a given device and say this device lands on this particular segment, or to micro-segment it, as to say this service should only be allowed to access this. So all of this provides you a security posture where you can effectively control what the device is allowed to do on the network. Next slide. And hopefully this will give you a little more light to that question. So this is an example. We have an mitigation screen. This is a snapshot of that. This is an example of Cisco ICE and PXGrid. So in what has happened in this example is we can do it on a given category or device. This has been done on a category. And in this category, a device was selected. We have masked out the device. And then an ICE policy was created where it was specifically meant to restrict neighbor traffic. Remember, I had mentioned that we create a topology, which we show graphically. We don't have the snapshot here, but we show graphically. And then that information is fed to the solution on the mitigation side. So you can automatically create an ACL policy that is specific to this device, to the context of it, to how it's connected. And here it's masked out the apply ACL because final connection was not established. So you can directly apply from the Asimily portal to the device so that it only follows this communication pattern and nothing else. Or you can download this ACL from day one and go and apply it on us, either way. So the integration is very deep. Basically, we are creating some of the ACL functionality on our solution. So you don't have to pay someone to go do it, and it's automatically done. Or you can directly apply it. And this is an example of restricting neighbor traffic, but you can block a service to go to a particular port. All kinds of permutations, combinations are possible. And these are very specific. Like every NAC is slightly different. So Cisco NAC is different from Palo Alto NAC and so on, Palo Alto firewalls. So these kind of integrations that we do are specific, but the broad concept that we have at the back end is generic. So once we have done one, Cisco ISP now we're doing with Palo Alto, we have almost done there. It then becomes easy to replicate it from one NAC to the other. And then the final piece I wanted to go over was the forensic analysis. So why forensic analysis is important, and this is something that we have learned in our experience with health systems over time. The reason forensic analysis is important is because a lot of people say, hey, I'll do the inventory, I'll do the anomaly. They say, I'll find some vulnerability, which we think is a very key piece. We have spent a lot of time there, like I said. But then after that, because it's always a risk management problem, what do you do when you want to go back and check whether something is not working, or whether when there is an anomaly, you want to go back and find the root cause? This is an area where we have spent a lot of time on, and there are broadly, at a very high level, there are two aspects we look at here. Understanding how the device is communicating, and there's a lot of granularity here I'll cover in the next slide, and then understanding the root cause of the problem. And the root cause of the problem is a very important one, because let's say something happened to one of the devices. Let's say the device is communicating to some random IP. Okay, you see the anomaly. But why is it communicating to a random IP? Did someone communicate to it? Did it communicate outside on its own? Like, what's happening? So you have to be able to go back and find the source of the problem. And that is a very critical element of forensic analysis. And then a lot of times you'll find it's a misconfiguration, or it's something somebody should not have done in your network. But knowing that saves a lot of time. Next slide. So this is just the first example. I'm just taking the first piece on communicating, knowing where the device is communicating as part of forensics. And here, this is again some snapshot from the portal for one of the devices. So here the solution is outlining where the data is flowing. And this is not a topology map. There's a separate topology map. This is what we call analysis of the data. So here it shows this device, which is anonymized, is transmitted some 139 MB of data. but it shows you what are the IPs that is transmitting most of the data. And in this case, it's transmitting to a PAX workstation, most of its data. It's telling you, you can actually drill down and say, okay, it's transmitting so much data, but on what port is the data communicating on? And how much data is getting transmitted on that? So you said, okay, this is, as you can see, it's an imaging, some form of imaging device. And you say, okay, I know where the data is flowing, but on what service? Okay, let's say I want to see where is the PHI flowing. So you open DICOM and you drill down into how much information is flowing on DICOM. So that is how much data is flowing. And then you say, okay, but I want to know when the data flowed, like, and how much was flowing in a slot. So you go to the bottom graph and it tells you, it's not fully visible, but it actually tells you on an hour-to-hour basis how much data is flowing. So you're getting the where the data is flowing, which IPs, how much data is flowing, and on what service from DICOM. And then from an hour-to-hour basis, you can break it down into chunks and say, out of my X MB of data, let's say Y MB of data flowed from 11 to 12 a.m. on a Tuesday, September 12th. I'm making it up. Or like on a September 11th, I think it says here, from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., 5 MB of data flowed. So this becomes extremely valuable when you want to analyze. And this is even more important when, let's say, a manufacturer is accessing your portal. Because a lot of times you see a manufacturer logging in, doing FTPs. But what is the manufacturer doing? How much data are they transferring? Or how much data is any external entity transferring out of your network? When are they transferring? Is it following a cadence? All of that you can get in the order of seconds by just looking at this data. And then you can go back to your contract, or you can contact them and decide whether you want to act on it. And if there is a problem, you can take action right away. Next one. And this is the final slide I want to cover before I hand it back to Priya. So there are other benefits of such a platform. Now, we spoke a lot about the 4 big key elements, but there are others. Like one big element is asset utilization. We track the utilization of every device. So on the left graph at the top, it shows for an imaging device how the utilization has changed over a week. And then you can see there's a periodicity from an hour-to-hour basis on the right graph on how it's being used. And this is going to help with both the devices, how they are being used, and how they can help with downtime planning and maintenance strategy, because you want to service the device when it's actually at its downtime. And that's when you really want to take action on the device and do something. So you can see some periodicity when you chart this graph over time, and then you can actually track your planning and your maintenance. Another key part we have seen is transparency is very important. While we work with Banner or any other health system that we are working on, we always only claim what we can do, and never beyond. And whatever is in our roadmap, we say it's in our roadmap. And then pricing, we try and make sure that it's in line with the industry. So that, and we always made sure we work with the health system so that we can match their budget constraints, and we have different pricing models. We have done that. And the other key thing is this is an evolving market, so the roadmap is continuously evolving. So, for example, FDA recall monitoring, we haven't spoken about it here, but we do that and we're expanding on that. And so you have to keep adapting and keep developing to evolve to the long-term goals and make sure you meet whatever is needed for the HTO. Well, with that, I'll hand it back to Priya.
Thank you, Shankar. And yes, we will share the slides after the webinar. And Shankar, there's one more question. So regarding data collection appliances, what has been your experience, perhaps specifically for the Banner example you provided, as to the required volume of appliances to capture all medical devices connected to the network? So let me take a first stab at that. At Banner, when we started the proof of concept testing, we used 2 appliances to capture data from 4 of the sites. One was a large corporate site and 3 were hospitals, varying in small, medium, and large-sized hospitals. So I think 1 would have been enough, but we wanted to see what would be the capacity and the performance with having 2. And initially, before we applied a lot of the filtering to capture traffic from the different sites, it was actually collecting all the data from all the sites. However, in some cases, the network architecture is different, and we don't have an accurate flow of traffic. So that's where we're using a separate appliance at the site level itself. Another thing that we wanted to test is that delta between what kind of traffic or what kind of meaningful data you could get by deploying an appliance at the site level versus at the data center. Okay, getting back to this.
No, go ahead, Priya. We can cover it. So I was just going to say, just to quickly add to what she said, from our perspective, Asimelys perspective, I mean, we have a flexibility. We don't need to see every packet, so we are able to work with different number of appliances. We have different size appliances that can kind of reduce the number of appliances you need, but handle larger volume. Yeah. So there are a lot of options here.
Thank you, Shankar. So I hope all the information presented so far in just the feature sets of the devices is helpful as you meet with different vendors in this space and review their platform capabilities. So as you review the vendor operations and the capabilities of the platform itself, there are some important aspects to consider that we have just summarized on this slide. At Banner Health, we actually started off last year by meeting and doing several demonstrations with more than 5 or 6 vendors. And at the time that we started receiving documentation as part of the formal process, the various demonstrations actually helped us narrow down to 5 vendors. Furthermore, we didn't want to solely rely on just the documentation that was presented, but we wanted to install the tool itself and see how that installation process is, how is the support during various stages of installation, as well as use of the platform or the portal, as well as decommissioning whatever appliance is installed. So we proceeded to assess some more capabilities and narrowed down our search to about 2 vendors who would install their appliances at 4 locations, 3 hospital sites, which was a 20-bed hospital, another 170, and another was 450 plus. And we had 1 corporate location. So throughout this process, some of the main factors that led to our decision making that's described here on the left bar under vendor research, one of the main things is the financial status of the vendor. Are they capable of developing the platform and supporting it long term? Are they mature enough so they can provide meaningful information that will help grow our program and help manage our program better? The third aspect is scalability. Can they scale their platform across various care facilities that's varying in size, technological landscape, as well as support structures? Do they have professionals in the company that have knowledge of medical devices and how they function in the clinical environment? Proactiveness and support times is one of the main factors where you want to know, is the vendor proactive in discussing problems and solutions with your team? Do they respond in a timely manner? One interesting aspect that we encountered here during our evaluation period was how the vendor helped assess our data when the Blue Keep vulnerability notice was distributed. We wanted to check if they can not only help us identify the devices that were impacted, but also help us plan remediation activities and even simple things as navigating through the platform to produce metrics around that issue. So that really gave us a real-time assessment of how proactive and how supportive the vendor is and how knowledgeable their staff is about not only the technical information security stuff, but also the performance of the medical devices. Along the same lines, you also want to take a look at the market presence and accessibility of this vendor and their platform. Do they have a good relationship with their customers? Are they candid about what they can deliver and what they cannot? 2 of the main considerations here that go a long way is the long-term strategy and pricing. You want to assess if the vendor's long-term goals align with the goals of your program and organization. And with respect to pricing, you want to check if the pricing offer is consistent with what you're seeing in the industry. Are all the support and integration factors or costs for those integrations factored in? Are you limiting any feature sets or even the number of devices that are assessed to meet a budgetary allocation? You don't want to work backwards. And I think in the long run, these 2 will ultimately call the shots there. With the platform capabilities itself, you do want to assess, looking at the integration architectures with different subject matter experts in your organizations. Though we did not do any of the integrations as part of our proof of concept, we did review those capabilities with the specific teams that manage those tools, whether it was firewall management or network access controls. Through the proof of concept testing, you also want to check for the delivery time. What is, hardware delivery time? What is the software delivery time? If there are any crashes in either of those, what is the service level response time there? And also the quality of data that is produced. An important factor here is also how that data is collected. Do the methods support the standard processes of your organization? I know some organization does not allow tapping into a span port, so is that something that your organization is okay with or not? You want to check for the appropriateness of whatever your organization's process is. Does the vendor also provide training, not only verbally, but also with some documentation or live webinars or even recorded ones? And since this is a new space, I do see education and training as a very important factor because even as simple as just navigating through the platform to produce different reports or even check as and when you receive vulnerability notices. At the same time, you also want to check response times across different elements, whether it is the tool itself, the deployment architecture, or deploying the appliances, or even providing simple documents or reports or additional research on, exploit vector analysis or such. You don't want to check how responsive the vendor is. One of the things I have noticed and learned is that if the vendor is not responsive or proactive or even authentic during the time of this document collection or proof of concept, it's unlikely that they will be so after you sign a multi-million-dollar contract. In this aspect, we actually used a simple 10-factor rating scale as we assessed the vendor for their capabilities as well as the technical parameters of the platform itself. So the team that actually evaluated the vendor as well as the platform was multidisciplinary. It included experts from IT, healthcare technology management, the clinical business, and in supply chain. Some of the scoring for capabilities here, you can actually see some of the different criteria for scoring the vendors. Again, something that I discussed in the previous slide. And just this small snapshot of the different rating factors, the description, and then the scores. Same thing for the platform capabilities itself. This was also done using a simple 10-factor rating scale. And each criterion here represents a NIST CSF element that actually fits the programmatic gaps. And under the description, we have the specifics around each of those NIST CSF elements. And we're happy to share the details of how the scoring was done, what are the different criteria that was actually evaluated. Cory?
Thank you. So this slide just displays our suggested primary success metrics that an organization should look for when actually using this risk management solution. So moving past, the initial evaluation process and having implemented a full-scale deployment of a solution, you'll want to start to define or hopefully have these metrics defined already to start reporting on organizational risk. And we really break these down into 4 key areas. The first area being inventory. So the percentage of accurate data monthly, missing data attributes that'll require manual cross-checking, things like potentially serial numbers or operating systems that weren't discovered during the scanning process that need to be looked at on the device specifically, potentially during scheduled maintenance. The number of devices with EPHI, those that store, transmit, and process EPHI. Number of devices and types, device types that have an MDS2 form. That way you can start to request those MDS2 forms for documentation purposes and to better inform your security processes for those devices, for the devices that don't have an MDS2 form currently in your repository. The devices with risk profiles, so patient data and business impacts and what that risk profile looks like for those devices. The number of new and missing assets, potentially, I know Shankar talked about that, but having the ability to document any missing assets from the network is very instrumental. And the number of devices with an outdated operating system, really, so you can start to prioritize those for remediation. And the second piece there being vulnerability management. So how many active technical vulnerabilities per device type, again, goes into your risk profiling. On the number of critical high-risk vulnerabilities, as well as the number of critical and high-risk mitigations that are available. The third piece there is asset utilization, really mainly used for capital equipment replacement planning purposes, but also to get a better understanding of the device usage. So you'll get that, information on the device type by percentage, or the percentage of utilization by device type monthly. And the last piece there are the flow analytics. So I usually call that the network fingerprinting when I'm explaining those characteristics. But it's basically like creating a network fingerprint or profile for each of the connected medical devices by reporting on the internal and external communications for each device, as well as the VLAN structure and the mapping of the organization's network and specifically how that looks for those devices. And I think this is the last slide. I'll try to wrap it up here pretty quickly so we have time for questions. But this is probably one of the most important slides in the deck as well, because it's pretty tough for the three of us to narrow down these lessons learned to just what's here on the slide, because this process has been evolving really quickly in a short amount of time. So if anyone tells you any differently, they found a magic formula or an easy button that we don't know about. But between the three of our experiences, Priya from the healthcare provider, Shankar from the vendor, and myself from the service provider perspective, we put these together as examples of lessons learned during the process of selecting a risk management solution. So first, from the HDO perspective, it's super important to plan your processes before you implement a platform that provides you visibility of risks across the enterprise network. Because as soon as you begin to learn about and report on those risks, it's going to be instrumental to have some kind of standard operating procedures to lean on in order to begin mitigating or taking care of those risks. Without those processes in place, it becomes much more difficult, especially around defining roles and responsibilities for that process. You want to be able to report on those risks, but you also want to be able to report that you're making progress on those risks. Also, it's important to implement different platforms or solutions at clearly defined pilot sites and assess the data that the solution compiles for each of those pilot sites. As Priya mentioned earlier, they had a couple of different pilot sites that they used, and they wanted to assess the data to see what was gathering better, more accurate data from which location that they decided to implement, and to be able to determine which platform meets the organization's long-term program goals and needs. I know that Priya and her team did a ton of work around their pilot process before we began to even kind of come in and help them a little bit, but they had already done so much. From the vendor perspective, you really have to have a clear understanding of how the data is going to be gathered, as well as key points on the network or even within the organization to place the data capturing tools. Again, that goes back to that same question. So without having that clear expectation, we've seen a lot of confusion and honestly some last minute scrambling just to ensure that the infrastructure and processes are in place to support the pilot for this type of risk management solution, because it really needs to be piloted at the right location in order to get the most accurate and comprehensive data. And frankly, it's been a pleasure on the service provider side to have worked so often with Shankar and his team, because they really don't hesitate at all to be very transparent and have an honest conversation with the health system and project leadership if it's needed around expectations for timelines and data accuracy based on how and where the health system has chosen to place the solution's data collection points. So it's super important to work with a transparent vendor, and I've definitely seen how Priya and her team at Banner have valued those conversations as well. And so last, from the service provider perspective, we have very similar expectations as the health systems do when we are evaluating the solutions from our preferred vendors, but potentially even more expansive because we have to make sure that the solutions will meet all of the needs of a very diverse portfolio of clients. So for us, it's been very important to have a well-defined set of use cases and requirements to test the solutions against, and honestly to continue updating those needs and requirements regularly to ensure that the solutions are keeping up with the evolving industry processes. And again, really just working with a vendor who's going to be flexible and most importantly, helpful, and working with multiple different clients, some with very complex network structures and some with very differing expectations. This is definitely something we've learned the hard way, and it can almost be irreplaceable when you're determining which vendor you're going to go with for the solution. So, so that's a little bit about the lessons learned here. I think we're going to move into Q&A.
Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Cory, for your expertise and your time on this. And now we'll open up for questions. So we had a question about getting the slides, and yes, the slides will be distributed to all the attendees after this webinar. And Shankar, can you share a little more about how your experience has been working on different integrations? What does that entail, or maybe provide a timeline around how long does it take to install the Asimily platform at a health system of maybe varying size? Let's go with a medium size for this.
Got it. So, I mean, from our perspective, the process is very simple, and I say plug and play. And I know a lot of people say it, but it's truly plug and play, as Priya and others I know will attest to it. So the process is we give a list of questions that you need to answer, which is really on how to configure our edge appliance, which is the hardware we ship to install at a given site. And that hardware, when it's shipped at a given site, you answer the questions. We know how to configure it. We configure and ship it. The answering the questions literally is should be a half-an-hour job or less for your network team. And once we ship the box, somebody has to receive it and connect it to the SPAN or tap port. And that's pretty much it. And if you have given us the right IP that we have to configure the box with, the firewall rules have been set correctly, and we tell you what those are up front, then things definitely work out of the box. We haven't seen any problems. The general problem is that, IP has changed, or the firewall rules have not been set by the network team. But those are clearly laid out, told up front in advance, and once you get the box, it's literally plug and play. So that's really on the installation side. And then just quickly touch on the integration side. So in the integration, we integrate with a number of different elements. We work with the vendor, with the other vendor at the back end, whether it's a Nuvolo or a Connective, or it's a Cisco, or whether it's a Splunk, whoever it might be, to build those integrations out. So it's pretty out of the box integrations, and then we regularly work through these to get certified. And if there's any new integrations, we effectively work with the vendor. We have done most of the big components like NAC and SIM and network. So now if it's a new integration, we already have a lot of legwork done. It's really a rinse and repeat. And so even new integrations we are able to do quickly. And so once what we do is we deploy the product, and after that we discuss a timeline with the HTO, and we actually take like integration step by step. And depending on the HTO, we work with them just to do the out-of-the-box integration, or if we have to do something on our side, we go and work with a vendor on the back end. But since we have covered all the different elements, it becomes pretty quick for us on our side as well. So we have been able to add more integrations quickly.
Thank you, Shankar. Cory, this is a question for you. So along with the program assessment and the technical assessment and the risk management strategy, project that you have, can you give us a little more detail about the services provided from Synergistek, about how you're assessing the program as well as the technical elements of these solutions and what they can deliver to a health system?
Definitely. So as part of what we are assessing for the health system, we do have the program assessment piece, which really determines the program maturity for the healthcare organization's medical device security program. So whether they have, current policies and procedures in place to be able to support the medical device security program, as well as the use of a long-term solution. And again, as part of the technical assessment component, we use a solution, in most cases, we use the Asimily solution to do a scan of the network to provide the health system with an inventory of their network connected medical devices and all the information that Shankar went through on the slides, the network profiles, the active technical vulnerabilities and FDA recalls. But we actually put it up against, again, as I mentioned before, the NIST cybersecurity framework and the HIPAA frameworks as well, just to provide the organization with a full-scale risk strategy and recommendations for remediating the risks that we've identified as part of that assessment process. But what's really kind of happening, and really it's as the industry is evolving and we're working with more and more clients, is that once our clients are getting those reports, it's really very resource intensive to start working through some of those remediation aspects, both on the programmatic side as well as on the technical side. And usually the first recommendation is get a vulnerability and risk management solution in place long-term to start using to manage these vulnerabilities and to start remediating some of these devices. So we work with our clients to determine which of those solutions that they'd like to use. We have the use cases that we've put together. We have the industry experience. And again, having worked with the vendors so much in the past, we can really help to inform our clients in that process. But ultimately, they have to choose kind of what works best for their organization. But we will then, help them to get the solution implemented, to build the standard operating procedures around using that solution and make sure that it's aligned with the information security and clinical engineering policies and procedures at the site level as well. That way you can really start to, train and educate any resources that are involved in managing this process. And also, again, start to, have those metrics defined to start reporting on the risk and the progress that's being made in remediating that risk. So it's really, going from assessing the organization as a whole, as well as the individual devices at the technical level, to developing the program to support a full-scale, medical device security program and process at the organization, and managing that process as you go.
Thank you, Cory. Shankar, there's another question for you. Have there been situations where the device identified by Asimily is not in fact what the device is? If so, how many of these issues have been found?
So that's a great question. So first of all, if I take Banner or any of the other health systems we have worked with, or even through Synergistek, we have worked with many more. And one of the things that has been the highlight for us is that device classification. So risk is definitely one of our strong points. But even in classification, in every health system we have gone in, and where we have done pilots or where we have been competitive with everything else, we have found a very high level of accuracy on our classification, probably some of the best we have seen so far, or they have seen so far. So we have high level of accuracy. Having said that, I'll be the first to say I've been in networking for 20 years now, at least 15 directly working on it. And I would say that there is no silver bullet. There will always be those one-offs. For example, in one environment, we found a device was behind a one-way firewall. It was just a custom-built firewall they had. It was a really old imaging device, and you couldn't see any traffic from the device on the network, just a few pings. And so we don't know what the device is. We know it is not an IT device, just the characteristics of the traffic, but we don't know what exactly it is. In those cases, we mark it. We just say this is something to be looked at, or we mark it and say this could be a medical device, it could be a building device. So the accuracy, Asimily knows sometimes when it sees the characteristics, looking at the manufacturer, sometimes it's not what it appears to be. And so as a passive solution, there are limitations, and it's not 100%, but like I said, with Banner, we had like 99.5%, and there are places where we have had very high accuracy, but there will always be those one-offs. Hard to put a percentage on it, but it's generally been fairly low.
Thank you, Shankar. Another quick question. So regarding the accesses on your platform itself based on the different roles and responsibilities in the organization's process side, so can you explain a little more of how your tool can provide different sets of data depending on that team's role or the team member's roles?
That's a great question. So our solution has a variety of, because we work with many large health systems now and mid-size, and we have a variety of roles and responsibilities. So you can configure a user to only see medical devices. You can configure a user to only get IoT devices. Within that, you can configure a user and say, this user can only access to asset information, or they can get access only to vulnerability or recall information. And within that, you can actually configure it to say, you can get access to asset information, but you cannot modify anything. You cannot edit anything. You cannot write, or this person can do all of it, or any permutation or combination of everything I said. So there's a fairly deep roles and responsibility capabilities and configuration, and you can create any kind of new roles that you want. All of it you can use to give anyone what they want to see, how they want to see it, and customize the portal accordingly.
Thanks, Shankar. One last question before we end the webinar. So can you give some information about the appliance itself? What kind of an appliance is it, and what capabilities can it deliver?
So the appliance itself is a commodity. So first of all, we don't store any PHI on our appliance. So being in healthcare, we wanted to avoid storing any PHI. So it's a real-time streaming. So it's a commodity hardware we buy. We just plug it into your network. We even give you the specifications of the hardware. It's really just like a mini server. And if you want, you can buy your own hardware. And we'll ship it, we'll put our software on this. But it's a mini server we buy. It has some number of cores and RAM and storage. We put our software, and it's mainly used to actually take the traffic. Our algorithms are there to extract the device-related information and ship it to the cloud. That's what it fundamentally does. There is no storage of data on that other than some basic logs that we need. And I can provide more specifications offline if you're interested.
Thank you, Shankar. Again, thank you everyone for attending this webinar and giving your time to this. This is a very important topic, and hopefully the information has been helpful. We will have a white paper coming out in the next couple of months that will provide an overview of all the details that have gone into the selection process, so that can be taken and implemented at your organizations. Again, thanks to ACC for hosting this webinar, and thanks to Shankar and Cory for providing their insights. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.